Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. I was just mentioning to the guests that we are coming to the end of the 20th season of the Journey Home program. Who'd have guessed it after all these years? But thank you for joining us again. And as I normally do, I invite you to sit back and let's listen to a story on how the Holy Spirit has guided this guest with a couple pit stops. We'll find about those in a moment. Our guest is Melissa Zelniker-presser, is that correct?
You got it, Zelniker-presser.
Okay, well, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you, it's so good to be here.
You're listed as a convert from Judaism and non-denominational, so you've got a little bit of a journey there.
Yes, I definitely do.
All right, well, let me get out of the way and let me hear your story.
Well, I was Jewish. I still consider myself Jewish. That never changed. My husband is Jewish, and both sides of my family are Jewish.
All right.
So there are no Christians on either side. I grew up in a conservative Jewish upbringing, but my parents were not religious. And I actually...
You might need to, again, explain that to us.
Yes.
Those that are outside the fold.
So conservative Judaism is sort of in the middle. You have some more liberal congregations, and then you have Orthodox, which are very religious. So I would say it's somewhere in the middle in terms of upbringing, celebrating the holidays.
Conservative means holding on to the traditions of the faith,
yes,
not
definitely,
necessarily the religious side of things?
I would say it was definitely religious, definitely tradition, but not up to the point of orthodoxy. Okay. So in terms of maybe celebrating Shabbat or some of those things that are continuously celebrated more so on the Orthodox side. But the way I was brought up was more of a cultural Jew, I guess you could say. My parents were not religious, but I was always very close to God. So I would actually ask my parents to drop me off at synagogue on Shabbat, and they would drop me off so I could go to temple, I could go to shul, and I would go by myself, very, very young. And then I eventually asked them if I could go to Hebrew school. So I attended Hebrew school as well.
So if your parents weren't religious, did your genuine interest in God come as a result? If it didn't come from them, was it grace, or was it the experience of the temple, you think?
I think it was grace.
Yeah.
I always felt very, very close to God. I always did. I always had a relationship with Him. And my parents were very spiritual. We did speak about God in my house, and we did celebrate the Jewish holidays. It was important for me to learn Hebrew, and I wanted to be involved in the temple. Since I was part of a conservative Judaism movement, women weren't necessarily a big part of that, but I felt very passionate about it and strong about it to the point where, as long as I could learn as much as I could, then at that point I'd find some way to get myself into the temple and maybe find a place for myself, which was very difficult growing up in the 80s and 90s in that culture of Judaism.
Oh, okay.
So that was a little difficult, but yes, I did attend temple by myself most times.
And you went on to go through the rites of passage?
I did. I was bat mitzvahed,
Okay.
so that's the rite of passage into adulthood when you're about 13 years old for girls and boys. That was very important to me.
Yeah.
My father was also bar mitzvahed, so it is traditional, but it is also a celebration and a rite of passage. Jesus was bar mitzvahed.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And so that was a big milestone for me.
And because you were actually religious, you actually had a faith in God, and that it had that other meaning. It wasn't merely a rite of passage into adulthood.
Right. It wasn't merely tradition for me. For me, it was something, my next phase in terms of getting closer to God and seeing where He possibly would want me. Because at that point, I did have a lot of faith. I just was very unsure where God was going to lead me.
Yeah.
I was young too.
Yeah, and a girl in the 80s and 90s and
Yes.
dealing with that.
Yes.
One other thing I'd like to ask is, again, those of us that don't have the Judaism per se as a part of our background, was your branch of conservative Judaism in terms of your faith in God? How do you understand God on a day-by-day basis? Did you believe in an afterlife? Was there hope in life, or was he there walking beside you, as we would talk about from a Christian standpoint?
I think those were some of my initial questions that got my journey started towards Christ.
All right.
I really believed in heaven, and that really wasn't spoken about within the temple. I also believed in angels, and that was also a big kind of I guess, controversy in terms of something that wasn't spoken about.
Sure.
The other thing was in conservative Judaism, the services are in Hebrew. So I was praying, but most of the time, although I could read Hebrew, I didn't speak Hebrew. So I didn't know what exactly I was praying. I just knew I was praying, but I never prayed in English. So I didn't really have that personal relationship with God in that way. God was more of an entity to me.
Okay.
And I had a lot of questions about that because I started to think of eternity saying, well, I have friends that are not Jewish and I think they're going to be in heaven. So that kind of perplexed me as to why that wasn't spoken about in the synagogue, and why we didn't talk about other religions and whether or not they were going to heaven. And I felt like, well, I couldn't be the only one just because I'm Jewish. So.
Did I jump you ahead a bit, or were these the questions you had when you came out of your bat mitzvah? Or?
These were some of the questions, because after bat mitzvah, you do prepare similarly to, in terms of getting confirmed, and go through that confirmation. And it was during that time that I had a lot of upheaval, a lot of spiritual questions, a lot of theology questions, and something inside of me just didn't allow myself to get confirmed. Not that I didn't believe in Judaism or that it wasn't true. I felt that my journey was taking me elsewhere, and so I never actually got confirmed as a Jewish person.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
So that was kind of when things started, in my mind, the wheels started turning. Well, what about these other people? And I had this vision, I guess, that all Gentiles were Christians, because I came from a very close-knit Jewish community in South Florida, and we were close in the temple. We had a lot of youth group, and although I had a lot of friends outside of that, it was just a very close sect. So I didn't really understand and was never exposed to Christianity. I knew who Jesus was, but it was never a thought in my mind or something I contemplated. So I was never exposed to it at all.
And not really challenged to consider at that point in time jumping ship and becoming a Christian?
No, I think back to myself, because a lot of people have asked me, since my conversion, well, were you introduced to the church, or did someone come talk to you? And I don't know if my story is unique in that way, but I never really had that. I never, no one ever gave me a Bible, no one ever proselytized or evangelized, no one spoke to me about Jesus. I was very adamant about my beliefs about God, and that God was real, and God was present, and God was with me. But again, I didn't have that personal connection. God was a big, scary person, and I was a little peon here on earth, and I had to make sure that I did the things that I needed to do as a Jewish person, to be close to God. And those were the places I felt I fell short, because we had 613 things we had to do, and I wasn't even getting maybe the first 50 right. So those were some of the things I tried. I went and tried to keep kosher, and I would try to go to shul on Friday nights and Saturday mornings and learn more Hebrew. And I would just try a bunch of these, I guess, works-based religious types of things until I grew very tired.
Did you understand at that point, I don't want to take you away from telling us your journey, but if you were doing these rules correctly and therefore God was pleased with you, was your understanding that your life would be blessed? Or if you weren't doing things, then your life wouldn't be blessed? I mean, what was your connection with the reward system?
I never thought about being blessed.
Okay.
For me, it was always about doing what God wanted me to do, pleasing God. I didn't feel like I had to please an audience, or I was trying to obtain some special blessing. Okay. For me, I was always focused on, I know I'm here for a reason. There's a purpose to my life. God created me for a reason. He just didn't haphazardly put me on this earth, and he had a very true and specific reason. And that was what my frustration was, because the only path I knew, being a Jewish person, and then all sides of the family being Jewish, was, okay, well, maybe God's upset with me because I'm not keeping kosher, and maybe God's upset with me because I wasn't able to fast on Yom Kippur, and fast for those 24 hours. And I really didn't know how to pray, because my prayers were in a different language. So I was praying, but I didn't really have that attachment, because I was praying in a language that I didn't understand. But to me, that was the language God spoke, was Hebrew, because that's what we used when we were in synagogue. So it wasn't necessarily, like I said, to obtain some special place. I was really trying to find what my purpose was in life. And I was adamant about it, that I wasn't going to stop until I found out why God put me on the earth.
Certainly seems like a gift of grace that you would have within you, that sense in which
I think it was.
I'm here for a purpose, and God has a real plan for my life.
Yes, I think I sought that out every day, even at a very young age.
So now we're at the point in your journey. Are you a teenager? Are you in college?
Okay, so after, bat mitzvah and trying to figure things out, I really, I felt very distant from the synagogue because I was a female, and I felt that I just really didn't have a place during that time, at least in South Florida. A lot of the Chabads were coming into being, and Kabbalah was coming about, as very popular. And my grandfather died, and that was a significant event in my life. None of my family was very religious, and so when the rabbi came over to pray after someone passes away, we have a shiva, so everybody comes over and prays and eats a lot. And the rabbi came and said, "Okay, it's time to say, the prayers." And he said, "Well, I need a man for that." And I said, "Wait, well, I'm sitting right here. You have me." And then we went back and forth a little bit. And it just so happened to be that nobody in the room was a male who knew the Kaddish, who knew the prayers. And so I said, "Well, your choice is me or nobody." And so I prayed and he watched.
Really?
Yes. And that was, it was very hurtful, but at the same time, it was very liberating because it was in my mother's house. It was my grandfather. And at some point, I wasn't paying attention, but at some point he joined me in praying because I knew I was going to be the one to say those prayers for my grandfather. And that was very significant to me because I didn't think God looked at me differently because I was a woman or female. My thought was, well, this is my grandfather who died, and who would be the best person to pray for him would be me. I'm the only one that knows Hebrew, how to read Hebrew and pray in Hebrew and knows the prayers to pray. So that was pretty significant.
All right. Our guest is Melissa Zelniker-presser. And that's a bold move when you're in the midst of a very tight tradition.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And I was young. I was 16. But I was always very bold. So that didn't strike my parents as odd.
All right.
Yes, so I think I continued on that way. Of course, I went to college, and that was when I started to kind of question myself in terms of, where do I belong? I would go to service, and especially on the high holy holidays, which a lot of people do. They don't go maybe every weekend, but for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I would sit at service, and I would kind of just feel very alone and feel nothing, feel very disconnected from God. I was away from my parents, and I was away from South Florida, and I just couldn't kind of find my place. But what's interesting in going back in my mind is during that time, I was evangelized many, many times. I did go to church a couple of times, and I specifically remember I was new. I had transferred campuses. I had been at one college and then transferred to another one, and kind of walking around, and there was these two women or girls that were there, and they said, "Well, you should come to church with us." And I was all about meeting new people and friends. I'm very social. I said, "Sure." So I think it was the middle of maybe Christmas time, and they were having a play, and so afterwards we were talking, and they were definitely trying to evangelize me. I felt sort of uncomfortable, and they said, "Oh, we have another Jewish person here." They were like, Annie, and I was very embarrassed, and I said it was, thanks but no thanks, and but it seemed like, and back then I didn't really make the connection, but little by little there were more people talking to me or just talking about Jesus, about Christianity, but I still, for some reason in my mind, thought that only Gentiles were Christian. I still had that in my mind, so I'm like, well, why would they be talking to me about Jesus?
You hadn't met a converted Jew? I
had never met nor heard of a converted Jew. In fact, growing up, I was told the group Jews for Jesus, which is a wonderful ministry, I was told that they were a cult, and I had to stay away from them. And so, I that's kind of how I was taught. I don't think it was one person specifically. It was just kind of what was on my brain, I guess, at the time. So yeah, it kind of scared me a little bit, even to be in a church and God's going to hate me, and kind of why am I here and why do people keep talking to me about this Jesus? Don't they know I'm Jewish? And I would wear a big Jewish star. I don't understand that. So, and no, I had never met a Jewish convert.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, and those, if they were very, very conservative Christians, they would have seen you as a target because you're obviously outside from their perspective, outside the faith, and need to be saved, of course.
Yes, and so that was kind of, I think the dialogue was a little softer. I don't think they necessarily talked to me about salvation because initially it was, well, have you heard about Jesus? And my first response was, well, of course I've heard about Jesus. I'm Jewish though, I'm sure there are plenty of other people you can talk to, but I'm not one of them. But it happened continually. It happened quite a bit when I was in college.
Right.
So that was interesting.
All right. Well, was there a spark that moved you the next step of your journey?
It wasn't until later. I had a big jump in my journey. And so I don't think I ever necessarily left God during that time period. It really wasn't until 2007. So that's quite a jump.
Yeah.
My grandmother passed away. She was never sick.
During that whole period, you were still active in temple, and
I was
stuff?
still going to temple. I would go for high holy days. I got married. I urged my husband to celebrate Shabbat. He is Israeli, born in Tel Aviv, and his whole family is Jewish as well. And I would say he was Jewish by culture, but I would say he was definitely more of an atheist. So it was an interesting mix. But once we had children, that was a little bit different. But I guess when we first got married was when the next, segment happened where we weren't expecting my grandmother to be sick. She was kind of almost the centerpiece of my wedding. She was my closest ally, best friend. She had a heart attack about 2 weeks before my wedding. And so it was a very difficult time. I, of course, was questioning God in a way. Well, how could this possibly happen? But after that, she died shortly after my wedding in September of 2007. And so I remember saying to God, I wasn't angry with God. I just remember saying to him, I'm going to go my way and you can go yours. And we kind of parted ways. I would never have considered myself an atheist. It was more, I don't understand God, in this height of my life and, getting married to the love of my life and, my grandmother being the centerpiece of my life, how you could take her from me during this time. But again, I wasn't angry. I just said, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. Again, that checkoff list. And I've been a good and faithful Jewish person. And I've loved you all these years. And you took her from me. So I almost in my mind envisioned I went to the right and he went to the left.
When you say, I'm trying to get in your mind at that time, when you said he took her from you, did you believe that she was with God, or that there was just no answer to that at that point in your life? Or
I was pretty far from God at that point.
So,
I don't know. Jewish death and Judaism was always, again, coming back to my childhood with heaven and these questions. Right. I always remember at Jewish funerals just everything being so sad. And there was no hope. And there was no resurrection, and there was no something on the other side. So because I didn't understand that, I didn't feel like I had any hope. And so even at her funeral, I remember I'd gone to a couple of Gentile funerals or Christian funerals. And I remember thinking to myself, there's so much hope here. There's so much love. There's a lot of happiness. And I couldn't understand that because really, like I said, it's a very mournful time for Jews and reverent time for Jews. And so at my grandmother's funeral, I said to my mom, we have to release butterflies. We have to release butterflies because there had to be some life that was there. I couldn't deal with the darkness of it. And I also didn't know where she was. And that caused me a lot of pain, although I really believed she was still with me in some ways. I would talk to her or visit her at the gravesite, but the pain, it was very painful, and I also didn't know what to do with that pain. And so because I had said goodbye to God, I felt that I didn't have a right to go to God with my pain, because although I didn't blame him, I also thought he had some hand in it. So I didn't feel right going back to him at that point. So I stayed away from God.
You're off in a different direction.
I was completely off in a different direction at that point, right? So, I think a lot of my grandmother's death, which I assume for a lot of people who have some sort of faith, so many questions come up, especially when the person is very close to you. Why God, and what am I going to do now, and where do I go?
Especially because sometimes it hits us so much harder than we thought it would.
Yes.
When someone that close dies.
Yes, and I think it doesn't matter, how I got a lot of commentary. Well, she was older, and some things that people say they're very insensitive. And I said, well, she was my best friend in the whole world. Yeah. She could have been 20. I mean, it didn't really matter how old she was. But I had a lot of problems processing that, and so at the time we actually thought after we got married. Because we had gotten married in June, she didn't die till September. We actually thought, I had gotten a positive pregnancy test during that time, right after we got married. So I was able to kind of talk to her in the hospital, and I thought I was going to have a baby. And in my mind, I thought, well, she could just know that I'm going to have this baby, that maybe there'll be some peace there. But that pregnancy didn't end up coming to fruition. Okay. So that was very difficult too. But once she did pass, it was really a wide chasm for a lot of pain that I had, and a lot of searching. And I think that's when God really blew the door wide open, I guess, so to speak, for me to find my way back. But I didn't know where that was.
All right. So let's talk about that part of your journey then. So the door opens in a different direction?
I started to explore different things. I didn't feel, to me, Judaism wasn't home anymore, although I knew I would always be Jewish. That's who I am. So, I looked at things like Buddhism and Kabbalah, some sects of Judaism that were a little bit different or more spiritual in my mind. And all of those roads just seemed so wrong in a way. I don't know why, but it was almost like they just stopped. And there was just nothing there. And I almost felt God waiting for me to come back, kind of saying to me, when you're ready, I'm ready. But it wasn't until 2013 that really Christianity entered the picture. Okay. So we have a very close family friend. She's actually not my godmother, who I never knew was a Christian. I was sitting at home one day, just going through a very rough period. And I reached out to her out of nowhere. That's why the story's so odd to some people, because, it wasn't like, someone was sitting talking to me about Jesus again. And I reached out to her and I said, do you go to church? And can I come with you? And she reached back out to me with, of course, a long email telling me I had a divine appointment, and that yes, and that she would meet me and we would go to church together. So I was a little afraid to tell my husband, but I did. I told him, yes, I'm going to go there, because I was I was in a bad place at the time in my life, and I always knew that at the end of the day that the only place I could run back to was God. Why I chose to ask to go to a church, only the Holy Spirit knows that, because I was a little Jewish girl. I didn't know anything about churches, so... So she took me, and it was a non-denominational church, very liberal. People were dressed in shorts, and I came in my temple gear with very conservatively dressed. So I looked very out of place. I was very, very afraid, very afraid. I felt like people were looking at me, although of course no one's looking at me because no one knows you're Jewish. And I was sitting in the seats. And the pastor was a traveling pastor, so their pastor was off on a mission trip somewhere. And the pastor starts talking about literally every single thing that's going on in my life. And I got very angry. And I looked over at my godmother, Karen, and I said, how could you do this to me? How could you bring this pastor in and you told him all of my problems? And she just started crying. And she said, Melissa, that's God. I said, what do you mean that's God? And I remember thinking this was like the segment Punk'd, where I was being fooled and there was cameras, or somebody knew about my story somehow, and it was very personal what was going on in my life at the time. And she went on to explain to me, kind of whispering in my ear as the sermon was going on, about the Holy Spirit and how God works. And so that was very unnerving to me, thinking that God could be present on a stage in some human being I've never met, and know that I was supposed to be there that day. So that was very scary.
So was that direct and personal.
It was that direct and personal. After the sermon, I was shaking. I was visibly upset, and so Karen took me over to a couch, and she prayed over me in English. And that was the first time I'd ever heard anybody pray in English, and so boldly. And she prayed over me, and it was so touching because I understood the words for really the first time. And I really thought it was wrong to pray in English. In my mind, it wasn't the holy language.
You're wondering if God understood.
Yes, I'm like, does God understand English? Yes, I wasn't quite sure. And it was, we were in the middle of this huge church, and I didn't care at that moment whether people were watching because I was so just overcome and couldn't believe that it was all happening. I asked her afterwards, we were walking out and they had a little store, and I said, well, would you buy me a Bible? I thought she was going to pass out. You want a Bible? I said, yes. Well, if I'm going to become a Christian, then I guess I need a Bible. I didn't even know what I was really saying. Right. But yes, she bought me a Bible. And that whole week when I went home, I just was very obsessed with the cross. I was buying crosses. I was looking at the cross, and when I went home during that period of time, that night actually, I literally felt Jesus. I was crying out to him, and I said to him, it was very scary to think that my whole life was about to change. And I said, Jesus, if you are who you say you are, and you are truly the Son of God, I said, and if you save me from my life, from myself, from all of these things that are going on in my life, that I promise you I will serve you for the rest of my life. And the next day when I woke up, it's hard to explain, but it was almost if I was completely empty, almost like a vase or a vat that's empty, and I felt just completely filled up, like a warmth that I can't explain, where all of the pain had receded, and it was just inexplicable. And I said, okay. I said, and now I know where I have to go. So I made good on my promise. And
now, this was one visit to church.
One visit.
And you probably hadn't read that New Testament very far yet.
I had never read the New Testament in my life.
You'd gotten the new Bible.
So I had gotten it, but I hadn't. I was reading it because I'm a pretty voracious reader. But it's strange. It's almost, I equate my conversion to the Apostle Paul on the Damascus Road. It was like immediately, because I had all that knowledge, from all of my Hebrew school and all of my studies, it was like I immediately knew the New Testament. I knew the stories. They sounded familiar to me, which is completely absurd because I had never read that before. And I did. I was reading just at a very fast pace that week. I mean, I think I may have just read all through the Gospels one night. I don't even recall because it was such a crazy period of time. And my husband said, well, how was it? How was church? And I said, I don't know. It was amazing. And I have to go back. And I said, and you have to go back. And, he basically said, I'm an atheist. What do you mean I have to go to church? We're two Jewish people. We don't go to church. But I did. He actually agreed. And I brought him back because he had seen that week the change in me. I was going through such a painful period. And really, truly, God did a miracle. I mean, he truly just cured overnight whatever was ailing me, and to bring me to a place where I could accept him. So I went back to that church with my godmother, and they did an altar call at the end, and all of a sudden I see everybody walking out the doors, and I see myself walking towards the altar, and my godmother's looking at me saying, where is she going? And I turned around and I said, I'm ready. Wow. So I accepted Christ at the end of the altar. And that was it. That was it for me. I started evangelizing like I had been, a minister all of my life, and just started proclaiming the gospel.
It does sound like Paul.
It was a Damascus Road experience. It was an amazing conversion, and it was fast, very, very fast. And I never looked back because I remembered that promise that I had made to God. And there's nothing else that it could ever explain what he did, because there was nothing else that could have fixed my life at that point except for his grace. And so I made him a promise that I would never turn around again. I would never leave him or forsake him, just as he said he would never leave us or forsake us. Although that's been difficult, of course, walking forward in the conversion, but I always go back to that promise I made to him.
I love that, again, go in the Old Testament, that wonderful verse in the Psalms, that when it talks about God giving us the desires of our heart, in Psalm 37. But if our desire is to do his will, if that's our desire, then he puts in our heart the desire he wants for us.
He does.
If we want to do his will. If we have something else we want to do, well, he might give us that, and it may not be the best thing for us. But if our desire is for what he wants, then he can put, and that's what it sounds like he gave to you.
It was because, again, even though I was apart from God, my life's desire was to know what God's purpose was for my life.
Right.
So did I know that he was going to make me a Christian? I mean, I could have never seen that coming from a million miles away. But when I knew that he had answered that very deep, longing prayer, it's almost like when St. Edith Stein says, my life was one long, prayer. That's essentially what my life was. Although I wasn't maybe cognizant of it or conscious
Right.
of it, it was a deep longing to know why I was created and to know that I was going to make some type of difference.
He gave you the answer to that. Let's pause now here, Melissa, and we'll come back after the break because you found Christ and you've surrendered to Christ.
I did.
All right. Well, there's more to the story. We'll get back in a little bit. All right. See you there. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Melissa Zelniker-presser, and I've interrupted you in the middle of your journey, but you found Christ by the grace of God.
I did, by the complete grace of God.
And almost in a spiritually infused knowledge and love of the cross and the love of our Lord Jesus. And again, like St. Paul, when the scales fell from his eyes, he's out evangelizing because people are wondering, wait a second, what's he doing evangelizing? And he didn't know a lot yet.
Yes.
It took him a while to kind of get it all together. Was that your same experience?
It was the same experience. People were very confused. At the time, I was still a very big part of social media because remember, I'd been living in the world, and so I was immediately coming out talking about Christ, conversion, salvation. People were super confused. I got a lot of hate mail. It was amazing because it was almost like I couldn't stop myself. It was completely consuming. But it was very similar to Paul when his friend said, okay, maybe you need a year off to go back home and kind of get your thoughts together because he was almost killed.
Right.
Which was, of course, maybe that wasn't that extreme for me, but I lost a lot of friends. That was very painful. I had kind of separated ways prior to my conversion with some of my friends, and I looked back and now I understand why, because God knew that it was going to be way more painful for everything to kind of happen at once. But slowly people were kind of falling out of my life. The scripture became very real about picking up your cross and following Christ, choosing, Christ over mother, father, sister, brother. All of those scriptures, I was living those scriptures. The pain was unreal because all of these people that had been in my life for so long couldn't understand. They thought I had been possessed. They thought that something happened to me. I was traumatized somehow or brainwashed. And they just felt that they couldn't be in my life anymore, so that was very difficult.
Often it's not only that you've accepted an entirely different religion, different tradition, but you're rejecting everything that they are too.
That's correct. I think they did.
In their mind.
Yes, in their mind.
Yeah.
And I think for Jews too, the Holocaust is such a big part of our life. We lost so many of our brothers and sisters. It's talked about daily. It's something that I've always studied and obviously been very close to my heart. Still not understanding maybe why it happened. And so I think even for modern day Jews, someone who's converted, not only are they rejecting their people, but what about all the people that died?
Yep.
And now you're running to the Gentile side, and you're not one of us anymore. And you're kind of saying, well, no, I'm still Jewish, and Jesus was Jewish, and Mary was Jewish, and they don't see it that way. And it's hard because you're trying to explain to your children why people aren't talking to you anymore. Yeah. And that was very painful, or why kids can't play with you anymore, because we were kind of almost like a pariah, because during that interim time, my husband also accepted Christ a couple of months later, which was huge because he was an Israeli atheist, so, non-practicing Jew. And he came to Christ, just like I said, a couple of months later, and we were living this Christian life, talking about Jesus, really evangelizing to our friends and our family, and nobody could understand. They thought we were both completely nuts. So that was difficult. Wow. That was difficult.
Non-denominational at this point.
Yes, we were still non-denominational, very, very involved in our church, loved our church. We had gone to several. At that time, I didn't understand as a Jewish person what the difference was between being a Protestant and a Catholic. I'm like, I'm at church. They're all the same. This is great. And so it really wasn't until I started blogging. I'm an attorney, but I also write, I freelance. And I started blogging and started realizing, there's all these other denominations out here, and wow, this is kind of strange. They don't believe maybe what I believe. And I kind of started seeing a lot of spats and theology discussions, and it was bothersome because I'm thinking, well, we're unified in the body of Christ, and we're all following Jesus, and it wasn't so that way. So blogging really kind of opened up my eyes to, I guess, the larger Christian world and some of the issues we face with all the various people and denominations. And that's when I started to ask a lot of questions in my mind about what really is non-denominational, and some of those more difficult questions.
Okay. All right.
During that time too, I started to miss my traditions. Because we were still celebrating the Jewish holidays, and we still do, although we incorporate Christ into them, so it's a little bit different. But I said to my husband, I'm like, there's this stage. It's not really an altar, and there's a pastor there, but there's nothing there. There's no candles, and there's no reverence, and there's no, and it just, the questions were just endless. But I think to top it off, what for me was problematic was I really felt this very strong urge from the Holy Spirit to pray in a chapel setting. And so I asked around, and somebody, I think it was maybe one of our pastors, said, no, my husband actually told me. He's like, did you know that we have a chapel here? Because it was a huge campus. And I said, that's great. And I went into the chapel, and I tried to pray, and I sat there, and I didn't feel anything. And again, it was like this blank slate. It was some pews, and it was a very simple cross, and people were kind of coming in and out. It wasn't very reverent. And that's kind of where my story kind of guided towards Catholicism. I started to call pretty much any non-denominational church or non-Catholic church, I guess you could say, in that greater area, and asking them what their hours were so I could come pray. And every response I got was, our church is closed during the day. And then I remember that during temple. I couldn't walk into temple during the day and pray. And so I started talking a lot about this on my blog, a lot. It was almost to the point of obsession. And I would sit and say to myself, there's got to be we're Christians. There's got to be a place that we can pray in reverence to the Lord. And a friend of mine, another blogging friend of mine out in Georgia, who was raised Anglican, she said, you have to read these 3 books about this saint. She was Jewish, and she's a convert to the Catholic faith. Her name is Edith Stein. Oh, wow. And she's amazing. And it never really crossed my mind that she was Catholic. There was a lot of, in the non-denominational movement in general, a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric, right, which I didn't enjoy that either. So for me, it's always been about, what does God want? What is God's will for me? I never looked at denomination, and that was just a very natural next step, was to take these books and to read these books, and that began my journey home.
All right. And what a person to focus on for your journey.
Yes. So I had 3 books, and I started to read about her, and I opened the first page, and it said Edith Stein was born on October 12th, and I dropped the book. because that's the day I was born. Page 2, Edith Stein's family was described, and it said Edith Stein's grandmother's name was Adelheid. Well, my grandmother's name is Adelaide, so it was the German version of Adelaide, Adelaide being a very, uncommon name. And I put the book down and I started to cry. And I said, what are the chances of this? Just that connection with my grandmother at the same day I was born. And as I read, I almost felt like she was there because our lives were so parallel. She was a philosopher. She was into psychology. She was, brilliant. She was, into schooling and education had been my life. And just her story was just so similar. And then there it was in the middle of the book, the Eucharist. And I said to myself, well, what is the Eucharist? I've never heard of this before. I didn't know anybody that was Catholic. So I started to read about the Eucharist, and it started to bring up all of these emotions in me, because that was one other thing that really bothered me in my non-denominational church was taking communion. We took communion, I think, once every couple of weeks, and I found it to be more in my mind of like a New Age meditation more so than it was something holy. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time, but I also, at that point, was still trying to figure out theology-wise where I was, and I was really reading. So when she started talking about taking the Eucharist, I said to myself, that's brilliant. That's amazing. And so I said to my husband, I got to get a box of matzah and a bottle of Manischewitz wine. He said, for what? And I said, I got to start taking communion every day. That's what Edith did. And so I go in my little closet, and I had my little Manischewitz cup and my little matzah. And I laugh now, of course. But I started telling, my non-denominational friends, I said, we have to start taking communion, and this is so important, and there's got to be a reason for this. Never thinking in a million years, God's going to make me a Catholic. Please, he already brought me to this non-denominational church, and half the people don't talk to me, so, or at least my old friends. So I did, but as I took it every day, I said, something's not right. Something doesn't feel quite right. And as I made my way through the books, it was really the last book I read by Diane Treflet, who's a dean at Seton Hall, who's done life study on Edith. And I'm like, no, Lord, I shut the book, because in the back of my mind, I already knew where I was going. And I said to myself, I've come this far. I've gone through so much adversity, converting, from being a Jewish person to being a Christian. Nobody really understood what I was at that point, in terms of the people that had been in my life. And I knew that if I made that next step, that chances were that the people who were non-Catholic would also reject me and not understand. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to go. It was such a short period of time. I mean, you're talking only really 2 years in the non-denominational movement. But I was teaching Bible study. I was very involved in my church. And so I asked a friend at work who was Catholic. He was really the only person I knew that was Catholic. And we had a church right close to where I work at my police department, St. Gregory's. And I was so afraid, and I would sit in the parking lot on my lunch break, and I would cry, please God, don't make me go in. Please God, don't make me go in. Until one day my friend Mauricio said, I'm going to go in with you. I'm going to take you in. And he took me in. And I didn't know at the time, but during that period of time, the Blessed Sacrament was there. And he took me in and said, I want you to kneel here and just look. And of course my heart is beating. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not a Catholic. But there was such a pull and such an aura about that chapel and about that place, and whatever I wasn't feeling spiritually in that chapel in the non-denominational church was everything I was feeling in that chapel. And I remember walking out and saying, please God, don't. Please God, don't. Because I wasn't ready. But at the same token, I went back to two things, which was the promise I had made to God that if he saves me, that I would do whatever he asked of me for the rest of my life. And obviously my earlier years, which was whatever God's will was for my life, that I would follow. And so a couple of days later, my husband didn't know any of this at this point, except that I had visited. I, again, on my lunch break said, I'm going back in, and didn't know what the Blessed Sacrament was, didn't know what I was kneeling before. And I came in and I silently prayed and I cried. I don't think they were more verbal prayers than they were tears that were prayers, which we know are prayers. And I walked out and I just felt a peace that was beyond anything I had experienced, even on my initial acceptance of Christ. And I got in the car and I felt different, still not knowing what the Blessed Sacrament was. And as I was driving out, I heard God audibly say to me, Melissa, it's time to come home. So that's when I...
To a home you didn't even know was a home.
Yes. I said, God, I don't even know a Catholic. Where are you sending me again, you know? But I wasn't afraid. It was that same feeling of, you know, God saying to me, do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be afraid. It kept coming up. And I always thought to myself, you know, in becoming a Christian, now that I had this personal relationship with Jesus, the way my life was going, the blessings that God had bestowed on me, everything that he had healed in my life and changed in my life, I didn't care anymore what anybody thought of me. I was past that point. Even if I had to live alone, I didn't care. I just wanted to do what God's will was. And so that started my journey into the Catholic faith.
Now our Lord says in his Sermon on the Mount that he had not come to destroy or to stop the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. So there's no words there where he was going to stop everything and start a brand new movement, but there was a continuity.
Yes.
And a unique fulfillment of that. Were you maybe seeing some of that in the context of the Eucharist and all of that?
Well, it was.
A connection with your past.
It was Jews who convert. We refer to ourselves as completed Jews. It's a full circle. Yeah. And it's funny because I had never been to a Mass. I had never been to a Catholic church. And again, the same friend said, well, I'm going to take you to Mass. I'm going to take you to, no, I'm good, you know, no, you have to go to Mass. Okay, so we happened to go to a parish, his parish, where they serve the wine as well. And when I sat down, it was like sitting down at a Passover table, the 4 cups of wine. And the tears again started to pour out. Had I not been in that parish, I don't know that I would have made the connection, because some parishes don't have more than the 1 cup. And I just saw God, and I just saw Passover, and I felt like I was back at temple, and there was the bema, and instead of a rabbi, there was a priest, but everything was full circle. You know, and I remember looking at the crucifix, you know, where it says in Latin, you know, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. And I remembered his promise to his people, and I was his people. And I looked up at him and I said, this is where I'm supposed to be. You know, this is where I'm supposed to be. And it was just amazing thinking to myself, the Mass is the Passover table, and and my mind just going crazy with all of the connections. And that's when I started to really hunger for the Eucharist, because I couldn't get in that line. And I was sitting there, you know, on that initial visit to that parish, saying to myself, okay, how am I going to do this? And going out to the priest and asking him about RCIA, and he said, oh, well, it's going to take a year. I said, but Father, I'm a Christian. Well, you know, there's other things that you may have to learn. And I remember saying to my friend Mauricio, well, I'm not ready for all of that yet, although God had different plans for me. So...
Was your husband aware of all this
he was,
by this time?
He was aware of it. He knows when God is working very prolifically in my life, because I go into this frenzy where, you know, no one else would really know what was going on, and he knows I'm being directed by the divine, because I wasn't thinking about anything else. And he also knew, I mean, what person in their right mind would accept a rejection like that after they had just gone through this huge conversion and rejection. And it was kind of right after that I started reading up on the Blessed Sacrament, that Jesus was really present. That blew me away. And I remember saying to my husband, you know, I have to go back. I have to go back and visit Jesus. And he just left me alone during that time period. You know, we really weren't attending a church because we were still kind of in that, you know, being unsure. And I was afraid, you know, to tell him that God was calling me to the Catholic Church. Although I had told him, I didn't think that it was going to happen so rapidly, but it did. It happened very rapidly.
All right.
So I started praying, okay, God, where do I go? I don't even know where there's a Catholic church. And so God had moved us to a different portion of South Florida, and he directed me to my current parish. And I took my youngest, she was having a difficult time at school that day, and we were on campus, and Father Ed just happened to be standing there. It was the middle of a weekday, and he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "No, I'm not quite sure whether or not you can help me, Father." But then he said, he saw the look in my face, the kind of the desperation. He said, "Well, just in case, the chapel's right over there and the church is over there." And then he said those magic words, "And they're both open." They're both open. And I remember going back to Edith's story when she had walked in on the woman who was kneeling, and I think she recalls saying something to the effect of, it was like she was talking to a friend. And she also was very taken aback by the fact that the Catholic Church was always open. And when she was contemplating her own conversion, where she was going to go, she had, the Lutheran side and she had the Catholic side. And that was also really prolific during my reading, was the fact that the Catholic Church is always open. And that's always the way that I envision God. God should always be open. Yeah. So, my daughter and I, it was funny, we sat down and we were there, and the Blessed Sacrament wasn't exposed, but was of course there. And I was explaining to her all the different things. And she was about 5 at the time, maybe. We were sitting there very quietly, and she leaned over and she whispered to me, "Mom, when does the show start?" It was very cute. And I explained to her that this was a quiet place to pray and what it was. And, and then she asked me why I was there. So then I had to start explaining to my kids what we were going to be doing. So that's when I started to attend Mass at my current parish. And what I would do is I have 3 children, and I would go to 4 Masses a weekend. I would take each one of them individually to a Mass, and I would go on my own, because I knew that there was no way that they were going to understand what it was, because they were very young. And so as the Mass was going on, I would explain to them what it was and what was happening. And at the time, my husband's, stance was, "Well, I will never step foot in a Catholic church. You will never get me into a Catholic church." He has since converted and was brought into the church this past Easter. But at the time, it was, no, this is never going to happen. But I knew better. I knew what God's promises were. I knew about the sacrament of marriage and unity and what God had done in my life. And so immediately when I was coming to Mass, I actually wasn't afraid that my family would be fragmented. I wasn't afraid that Shlomi would never come in. And I was listening to Catholic radio a lot during that time and learning a lot. I actually called into a lot of shows with a lot of questions. And I think it was either maybe Father Mitch or Father Larry said, pray before the Blessed Mother and just place Shlomi in her arms. And that's what I did every day for about 3 months. So
2 minutes to go, because I want to make sure that I know as you began the program, you made a very important statement to say, I was Jewish, I still am Jewish.
Yes.
Talk about the importance of that for you as a Catholic.
I will never not be Jewish, and I think that's the wonderful thing about the Catholic Church, is that everybody who knows me, they won't take that away from me either. That's where the wholeness comes in, and that's what Edith felt. Edith never separated herself from her Jewishness, and that was so important to her, and it's so important to the Church as well, the way they just really honor who I am, and never make me separate that, because I'm just a completed Jew, and I'm a Catholic now.
Yeah, and that's true. The Church for non-Catholic Christians that come into the Church. We certainly want to correct some misunderstandings and maybe some bad theology along the way, but we celebrate how God has been working in people's lives all along.
Yes, all along.
As he was in your life.
Yes, and I'm very thankful, for the time I spent at my non-denominational church. They're wonderful people. And I learned so much. I really did. Had I not had that opportunity, I wouldn't. Everything was the right timing for me, and I really cherished that time that I had, because it was part of that fullness when I came into the church, that I had such a great understanding, especially of the Bible and of the Scriptures. They just did an amazing job in helping me go through all of that during that time period.
And Our Lady.
Yes. Mary became very important in my life as well. She's who brought my husband into the church. I credit all of the prayers that I gave Shlomi over to her, and like I said, he came into the church this past Easter, about a year after I came in. So Our Lady has done amazing things in my life. Very grateful for her.
Melissa, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sharing. Wow, what a story. And it's just, to me, not really a story of intellect and knowledge, but how the Holy Spirit really can break through a lot of things and just touch someone and draw them home.
And I tell people that all the time. You know, I say, you just have to pray. You pray, and there was someone praying for me. I may never know who that person was, but they prayed for me.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. Melissa talks about a long journey, and we're all on long journeys, different kinds of journeys. The Holy Spirit touches us in a different way. Do we desire to do what he wants for us? Are we open to wherever God might lead us? That's what he needs from us, is an openness to what he will do in our life. And he promises to never leave us or forsake us. I pray that Her Journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.